At 2:40 p.m. on the 20th of October 1944, a fire department dispatcher in Cleveland, Ohio, received a frantic call. A resident on the city's east side reported a strange smell and a white cloud rolling across the street near the East Ohio Gas Company plant. Within 2 minutes, the cloud ignited. The first explosion was heard for miles. A column of flame shot hundreds of feet into the air. Windows shattered blocks away. The ground shook. Firefighters responded within minutes. They found the plant's liquefied natural gas storage tank number 4 engulfed in fire. But before they could begin attacking the flames, a second, more violent explosion occurred. This one did not come from the tank itself. It came from beneath the streets. Sewer grates blew open. Manhole covers flew like discs. Flames erupted from drains, from basement windows, from any opening that connected to the underground network of pipes and sewers. The gas had traveled unseen through the city's infrastructure, collecting in low points, in basements, in utility tunnels. And then it found an ignition source. By 3 p.m., the fire had spread to a residential neighborhood. More than 80 homes were on fire. The streets themselves seemed to burn. Firefighters faced a nightmare scenario. The fire was not above ground in any ordinary sense. It was coming from below. They could not reach the source. They could only fight the visible flames while the invisible fire continued to feed. The plant was operated by the East Ohio Gas Company, a subsidiary of Standard Oil. It was the first commercial liquefied natural gas facility in the United States. The idea was elegant in theory. Cool natural gas to -260 degrees Fahrenheit, turning it into a liquid that occupied 1/600th of its gaseous volume. That liquid could be stored in tanks and then reheated and sent into the pipeline system during peak demand. The plant had been in operation for only a few years. It was considered a marvel of engineering. Tank number 4 was a double-walled steel sphere. Between the inner and outer walls, a layer of insulation was meant to keep the liquefied gas cold. On that October afternoon, the tank was being filled, but a flaw had developed. A crack in the inner wall allowed the liquid to escape into the insulation. As the liquid warmed, it vaporized rapidly. The insulation could not contain the pressure. The gas pushed through the outer wall and into the open air. Because it was still extremely cold, it formed a visible white cloud of condensed moisture. That cloud was not water vapor. It was a mixture of natural gas and air, waiting for a spark. No one at the plant detected the leak in time. The gas had no odor. The company added mercaptan to the pipeline gas for odor, but the liquefied gas had not yet been odorized. The leak was invisible to the human senses until it had already formed a vapor cloud that drifted across the plant grounds and into the surrounding streets. By the time the cloud ignited, the damage was done. The initial fire from the tank was catastrophic, but the real horror was underground. The gas had seeped into the sewer system, which acted as a network of fuel lines leading directly into homes and businesses. Over the next several hours, the fire burned through the sewers, igniting one pocket of gas after another. Entire city blocks were consumed. Residents who had evacuated their homes watched from a distance as the flames followed the gas lines, turning ordinary residential streets into a corridor of fire. The response from the city and the gas company was chaotic. Fire departments from across the region rushed to the scene, but they had no experience with a liquefied natural gas fire. Standard firefighting techniques were useless. Water could not extinguish the fire because the gas was burning at the source. The only way to stop it was to shut off the flow of gas, but the gas was not flowing from a pipe. It was stored as liquid, and the liquid was still leaking. The tank itself had to be allowed to burn until the contents were consumed. More than 130 people died that day. Most were residents of the working-class neighborhood adjacent to the plant. Hundreds more were injured. The property damage was in the millions of dollars. The cause of the ignition was never definitively determined, but investigators believed it could have been a spark from a truck engine, an electrical switch, or even a pilot light in a nearby home. The exact source did not matter as much as the conditions that allowed the leak to reach such a wide area. What happened? The disaster is now remembered as the first major LNG accident in American history. But at the time, very few people understood what liquefied natural gas was, or what it could do. The East Ohio Gas Company saw the plant as a safe, efficient solution to seasonal demand spikes. They had built it with the best available technology, but that technology had a blind spot. The tank design lacked a secondary containment system. There was no dike around the tank to catch a liquid spill. There was no vapor detection system to warn of a leak. And there was no plan for what to do if a cloud of gas began to drift toward a populated area. The investigators who arrived after the disaster were from the United States Bureau of Mines, the National Board of Fire Underwriters, and the American Gas Association. They examined the remnants of tank number 4 with meticulous attention. They found the crack in the inner shell. They studied the insulation and determined that it had been soaked with liquid, compromising its ability to contain the vapor. They calculated the volume of gas that had escaped and the area it could cover. Their conclusions were stark. The tank had been built to standards that were insufficient for the risks involved. The insulation material was permeable. The outer shell was not designed to hold pressure. The plant had no automatic shutoff or remote monitoring for leaks. The gas company had relied on human observation and routine maintenance. But a cryogenic leak like this one was impossible to see until it was too late. The vapor cloud that formed was heavier than air and followed the path of least resistance. It flowed downhill, into the sewers, into the low points of the neighborhood. The sewer system became an unintentional pipeline of destruction. The investigation also revealed a systemic failure in oversight. The plant had been approved by local authorities who had no expertise in LNG safety. There were no federal regulations governing such facilities at the time. The industry was self-regulated, and the standards were developed by the companies themselves. This created an environment where innovation outpaced safety. In the aftermath of the fire, Cleveland rebuilt. The neighborhood was eventually cleared and redeveloped, but the scars remained in the memory of the survivors. The families of the victims received compensation from the gas company, but the legal process dragged on for years. The disaster led to new regulations for LNG storage. Dikes, vapor barriers, gas detection systems, and stricter material standards became part of the industry's code. The event also spurred research into cryogenic containment that continues to influence safety protocols today. But the deeper question is still worth asking. How could a single tank failure lead to a catastrophe that affected an entire neighborhood? The answer lies in the nature of liquefied natural gas. When it vaporizes, it expands rapidly and forms a flammable cloud that can travel long distances. At the time, the industry did not fully understand how far that cloud could go. The Cleveland explosion proved that a leak from a single tank could fill an entire sewer system with explosive gas. And once the gas was in the sewers, there was no way to stop it. Firefighters who responded that day described the impossible situation. They would put water on one house, only to see the flames jump to another house a block away. The fire was moving through the sewers, and the sewers ran everywhere. At one point, a fire captain ordered his men to abandon a street because the ground itself was burning. The heat was so intense that asphalt melted. Cars parked on the street exploded. Trees caught fire from the bottom up as the flames emerged from the soil. The human toll was measured not only in the dead, but in the displaced. More than 700 people were left homeless. Many of them had lost everything. They stood on sidewalks, wrapped in blankets, watching their homes collapse into fires that could not be extinguished. The relief effort was enormous but disorganized. The Red Cross set up shelters. The city provided food and clothing. But the trauma of watching a fire come from the ground, with no warning and no way to fight it, stayed with those who survived for the rest of their lives. The Cleveland gas explosion remains a foundational case study in industrial safety. It is taught in engineering schools and referenced in safety manuals. but it is also a human story. It is about a technological leap that outpaced the understanding of its risks. It is about a company that believed its systems were safe until they were not. And it is about a city that learned, in the most brutal way, that fire can come from anywhere, even from beneath the streets. At 2:30 p.m. on the 20th of October 1944, a series of explosions ripped through the East Ohio Gas Company's liquefied natural gas plant in Cleveland, Ohio. The first blast came from tank number 4, a sphere that had been quietly leaking for hours. The vapor cloud that had formed around the tank finally found a source of ignition. No one is sure exactly what sparked it. It could have been a truck engine, an electrical switch, or a pilot light in a nearby building. What is certain is that the explosion was massive. The sound was heard miles away. The fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. Within seconds, the entire plant was engulfed. The tank itself collapsed. The liquid inside poured out and ignited. The fire was so intense that it melted the asphalt on the streets surrounding the plant. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but they had no idea what they were facing. They saw a fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The flames were not just on the surface. They were coming out of manhole covers. They were shooting up from cracks in the pavement. The sewers had become chimneys, and the fire was using them to spread. At 2:32 p.m., 2 minutes after the first explosion, a second blast occurred several blocks away. A manhole cover was blown into the air by the pressure of ignited gas in the sewer line. Residents who had not yet evacuated ran from their homes. Some were caught in the street as flames erupted from the ground. The fire was moving faster than anyone could run. Fire department dispatchers began receiving calls from all over the neighborhood. People reported fires in their basements, fires in their garages, fires in their yards. The common thread was that the flames seemed to originate from below. At 2:35 p.m., a third explosion shattered the windows of a school 3 blocks from the plant. The building was evacuated just in time. Children were led out into the streets, coughing and crying. Some had minor burns from flying debris. Teachers tried to keep them calm, but the noise was overwhelming. The explosions were not single events. They were a chain reaction. The gas in the sewers was igniting pocket by pocket, and each ignition sent a shockwave through the underground network. The pressure pushed flames further down the lines, igniting new pockets. What happened? To answer that, we have to look at the nature of the leak itself. The crack in the inner shell of tank number 4 was small, no more than a hairline fracture, but it was enough to allow the liquefied natural gas to escape at high pressure. The liquid, at minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit, immediately began to boil as it hit the warmer outer shell and the air. This boiling created a large volume of gas. The gas was methane, colorless and odorless because the odorizing agent had not yet been added. It was heavier than air, so it did not rise. Instead, it flowed downhill, hugging the ground like a low fog. The plant was located on a slight elevation above the surrounding residential area. The gas followed the natural slope, moving away from the plant and into the streets. It seeped into basements through foundation cracks. It entered the sewer system through drain pipes and manhole covers. The sewer lines were dry in some sections, allowing the gas to accumulate freely. In other sections, the gas mixed with the humid air and formed a flammable mixture that only needed a spark. The initial ignition at the plant was likely caused by a mundane source. Investigators later found evidence of a truck with its engine running near the tank. The engine's electrical system could have produced a spark. Alternatively, a faulty light switch or a static discharge could have done it. The exact cause was never proven, but the conditions were perfect for ignition. Once the first explosion occurred, the rest was inevitable. The fire department responded with everything they had, but standard tactics for a natural gas fire involve shutting off the supply. In this case, there was no valve to close. The gas was coming from a leaking tank that was itself on fire. The only way to stop the flow was to let the tank burn until the liquid was consumed. That took hours. Meanwhile, the underground fire continued to spread. Firefighters tried to flood the sewers with water to displace the gas. They opened manhole covers and poured in water, but the water only made the situation worse. The water pushed the gas ahead of it, driving it into new sections of the sewer system. In some cases, the water itself ignited as the gas bubbled up through it. The strategy was abandoned. By 3 p.m., the fire had spread to cover an area of roughly 1 square mile. The neighborhood was a working-class district of wooden frame houses, many of them packed closely together. The fire consumed them one by one. Some houses collapsed into their own basements where the flames were hottest. Others were simply gutted, the walls and roofs falling inward. Residents fled in panic. Many did not have time to grab their belongings. They left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some were separated from family members and did not know if they were alive or dead. The streets were clogged with cars and people. Fire trucks could not reach the hardest hit areas because the roads were blocked or on fire themselves. At 3:15 p.m., a massive explosion occurred at the intersection of East 67th Street and St. Clair Avenue. The blast was so powerful that it threw a fire truck onto its side. Several firefighters were injured. The manhole cover at that intersection was found later embedded in the roof of a house 2 blocks away. The force of the blast had lifted it like a rocket. By early evening, the fire had begun to subside. The tank at the plant had burned itself out, but the underground fires continued. Firefighters worked through the night, opening every manhole they could find and trying to vent the remaining gas. Some sewers continued to burn for days. The smell of gas lingered in the neighborhood for weeks. The official death toll was 131 people, but the number may have been higher. Many victims were burned beyond recognition. Some were never found. The injured numbered in the hundreds. Many suffered severe burns to their hands, faces, and lungs from inhaling superheated air. The hospitals in Cleveland were overwhelmed. Doctors worked around the clock. The investigation that followed was exhaustive. Teams from the United States Bureau of Mines, the National Board of Fire Underwriters, and the American Gas Association examined the site. They studied the design of the tank, the materials used, the operating procedures, and the emergency response. They interviewed employees, firefighters, and survivors. Their report was damning. The tank had been built to a design that was common at the time. The inner shell was made of a nickel alloy that could withstand cryogenic temperatures, but the outer shell was not designed to contain the full pressure of a vaporizing liquid. It was meant only to hold the insulation. The insulation itself was a porous material that could absorb liquid if it leaked. Once the insulation became saturated, it lost its insulating properties and allowed the outer shell to cool rapidly. That cooling made the outer shell brittle. In this case, the outer shell cracked on the day of the disaster, but that crack was not the primary leak. The primary leak was in the inner shell. When the outer shell cracked, it allowed vapor to escape, but that was a symptom, not the cause. The investigation also found that the plant had no secondary containment. There was no dike or berm around the tank to catch a spill. There was no gas detection system. The company relied on visual inspections and manual gauges. The leak was discovered only when a worker noticed frost forming on the outer shell. By that time, the vapor cloud had already formed. The oversight problem was systemic. The plant had been built under a permit from the city of Cleveland, but the city had no experts in LNG safety. The standards were developed by the gas industry itself. There were no federal regulations. The East Ohio Gas Company had followed the best practices of the time, but those practices were based on incomplete knowledge. No one had fully understood how far a vapor cloud could travel. The human consequences were devastating. Over 700 people were left homeless. The Red Cross set up emergency shelters in schools and churches. The city provided food, clothing, and medical care, but the psychological trauma was harder to address. Survivors reported nightmares, flashbacks, and a persistent fear of the ground beneath their feet. Some refused to go into basements for years. The legal aftermath was complex. Lawsuits were filed against the East Ohio Gas Company. The company argued that the disaster was an unforeseeable accident. The court found that the company was negligent in its design and operation of the tank. Settlements were reached with many of the victims and their families, but the payments were modest by modern standards. Most families received a few $1,000s. Some received nothing. The disaster led to major changes in the LNG industry. Within a year, new safety standards were proposed. Dikes and vapor barriers became mandatory for new LNG storage tanks. Gas detection systems were required. The use of porous insulation materials was discontinued. The industry also began to study the behavior of LNG vapor clouds in greater detail. Wind tunnel tests and field experiments were conducted. The knowledge gained from Cleveland saved lives in later decades, but the event also raised deeper questions. Could it have been prevented? The answer is yes, but only if the risks had been properly understood. The company had faith in its technology. That faith was misplaced. The disaster is a reminder that every new industrial process carries unknown risks. When those risks are not studied, they can lead to catastrophe. Today, the site of the plant is a redeveloped area. A shopping center and a park now occupy the land. There is no memorial. The street names have changed. But the memory of the fire lives on in the files of safety regulators and in the oral histories of families who lost everything. The Cleveland gas explosion is not a well-known disaster. It is overshadowed by larger events like the Halifax explosion or the Texas City disaster. But for those who lived through it, it was the end of the world. The flames came from the ground. They followed the pathways that were meant to carry waste away. And in doing so, they turned a city's infrastructure against itself. The fire beneath the streets of Cleveland burned for 3 days. It was not fully extinguished until October 23rd. By then, the neighborhood was a wasteland. The investigation continued for months. The reports were published, the regulations were changed, and the disaster receded into history. But the question that lingers is not only how it happened, but how many times it could happen again. Every city with an aging gas infrastructure sits on top of a network of pipes. Some of those pipes are leaking. Some are waiting for a spark. On October 23, 1944, at 9:47 in the morning, the last pocket of flame in the sewers of Cleveland was finally extinguished. A fire crew working near the intersection of East 67th Street and Osage Road reported that the ground had stopped rumbling. The gas odor that had hung over the neighborhood for days was beginning to thin. The fire was out, but the damage was not yet fully known. What investigators found in the weeks that followed was a hidden history of failure. The tank that exploded at the East Ohio Gas Company plant was not an isolated piece of equipment. It was part of a system that had been designed with assumptions that were never tested. Those assumptions proved fatal. The Bureau of Mines report, published in 1946, contained a detailed timeline of what had happened. At 12:10 p.m. on October 20th, a pressure gauge in the control room showed a slight drop in tank pressure. The operators noted it but did not take action because the drop was within normal operating range. At 12:15 p.m., a worker walking past the tank noticed frost forming on the outer shell. He reported it to his supervisor. The supervisor ordered a crew to investigate. At 12:20 p.m., the crew arrived at the tank and began a visual inspection. At 12:21 p.m., the vapor cloud ignited. The crew was incinerated. The investigation revealed that the tank had been in operation for only 3 years. It was built in 1941 as part of a wartime expansion of natural gas storage capacity. The war effort required fuel for factories, homes, and military installations. The East Ohio Gas Company had been contracted to supply liquefied natural gas to the region. The tank was one of 3 identical structures built at the same site. The other 2 tanks did not fail, but they were located less than 200 feet from the one that did. Firefighters had sprayed them with water during the blaze to keep them cool. If those tanks had exploded, the death toll would have been far higher. The Bureau of Mines investigators conducted a metallurgical analysis of the tank fragments. They found that the inner shell had developed a hairline crack near the base. The crack was less than 1 inch long. It was caused by thermal stress from repeated filling and emptying cycles. Each time the tank was filled with liquefied natural gas at -260 degrees Fahrenheit, the inner shell contracted. Each time it was emptied, it expanded. Over time, the metal fatigued. The crack began small, then grew larger with each cycle. When it finally penetrated the full thickness of the inner shell, the liquid natural gas began to leak. The insulation material was a porous mineral wool called silocell. It was designed to absorb any liquid that leaked from the inner shell. But the silocell could only absorb a limited amount. Once it became saturated, the liquid began to accumulate at the bottom of the space between the inner and outer shells. As it pooled, it warmed up and vaporized. The vapor increased the pressure on the outer shell. The outer shell was not designed to hold pressure. It was a weatherproof cover, nothing more. The pressure pushed against the steel, and the steel, already embrittled by the cold, gave way. The outer shell failed at the top, not the bottom. That is why the vapor cloud was released near the rim of the tank and drifted downward. If the outer shell had failed at the bottom, the vapor might have pooled closer to the plant and ignited there. Instead, it drifted over a residential area. The Bureau of Mines report also examined the emergency response. The fire department arrived within minutes of the first explosion, but the firefighters had no training for an LNG fire. They had no foam. They had no equipment to seal a leak. They used water, which made the fire worse. The water turned to steam and expanded the vapor cloud. The steam also carried the gas into new areas of the sewer system. The fire department was fighting a fire they did not understand. The report concluded that the disaster was preventable. It cited 3 specific failures. First, the tank design did not include a secondary containment system. Second, the insulation material was not tested for its behavior under leak conditions. Third, the plant had no gas detection system. Every one of these failures was correctable. None had been corrected because the industry had not yet recognized the risks. But the report also identified a deeper problem. The liquefied natural gas industry had grown rapidly during the war. There were no established standards for safe design. Each company developed its own methods. The East Ohio Gas Company had consulted with engineers from other LNG facilities, but those facilities had not experienced a catastrophic leak. The assumption was that a leak would be detected and contained before it could cause harm. That assumption was wrong. The human toll of the disaster was documented in hospital records, newspaper accounts, and survivor interviews. 131 people were killed. Of those, 68 were burned beyond recognition. They were buried in a mass grave at Lakeview Cemetery. The funeral was held on October 25th. Thousands of mourners attended. The caskets were closed. The injured numbered 344. Many of them were treated at St. Alexis Hospital, located only a few blocks from the plant. The hospital had been damaged in the explosions. Windows were blown out. Ceilings collapsed. But the staff continued to work. Doctors performed surgeries by flashlight. Nurses wrapped burns with sheets torn from hospital beds. The Red Cross brought in additional supplies from surrounding cities. The survivors faced a long recovery. Many suffered from degree burns that required skin grafts. Some lost fingers or toes. Others had permanent lung damage from inhaling superheated air and smoke. Children were particularly affected. Their smaller bodies absorbed more heat per unit of mass. A 6-year-old girl named Mary Kovacs was found hiding under a bed in her home. The house was still burning. Firefighters pulled her out and carried her to a makeshift triage center in a school gymnasium. She died 2 days later. The psychological impact was also severe. Families who lost their homes were displaced for months. The Red Cross set up temporary housing in vacant buildings and trailers. Children were sent to live with relatives in other neighborhoods. Some families never returned. The neighborhood that had been a tight-knit community of Hungarian, Polish, and Italian immigrants was scattered. Many of the residents had worked at the gas plant. Now their workplace had destroyed their homes. The legal battles began almost immediately. The first lawsuit was filed on November 3, 1944, by a woman named Anna Gajewski, whose husband and 3 children had been killed. The suit alleged negligence in the design and operation of the tank. The East Ohio Gas Company argued that the disaster was an act of God, an unforeseeable event that no reasonable precautions could have prevented. The court rejected that argument. In a landmark ruling, the judge found that the company had a duty to anticipate the risks of its own technology. The company knew that LNG was flammable. It knew that a leak could occur. It had a responsibility to design the tank with redundancy and safety systems. It had not done so. The ruling established a precedent that would influence future industrial disaster litigation. Settlements were reached with most of the victims within 2 years. The amounts were small by modern standards. The average settlement was about $2,000, equivalent to roughly $30,000 today. Some families received nothing because they could not prove the deaths were directly caused by the explosion. The legal process was slow, expensive, and emotionally draining. The disaster also prompted action at the federal level. The United States Congress held hearings in early 1945. The testimony included statements from fire chiefs, gas company executives, and safety experts. The hearings revealed a patchwork of regulations that varied from city to city. Some cities required dikes around LNG tanks, others did not. Some required gas detection systems, others did not. The hearings led to the creation of the first national standard for LNG storage, issued by the American Standards Association in 1947. The standard mandated secondary containment, gas detection, and pressure relief systems. It also required that insulation materials be tested for their behavior under leak conditions. The standard became the basis for state and local codes across the country. Over the following decades, the industry continued to evolve. New tank designs used double walls with reinforced concrete outer shells. The space between the walls was filled with perlite, a non-porous insulation that would not absorb liquid. Vapor barriers were installed around the tanks to divert any leaking gas upward, where it could be safely vented. Gas detection systems became automated. Operators could monitor tank conditions from remote control rooms, but the problem of aging infrastructure remained. By the 1970s, many of the tanks built during the war were still in service. They had been retrofitted with new safety systems, but the underlying design was outdated. Some of those tanks continued to operate until the 1990s, when stricter regulations forced their retirement. The Cleveland gas explosion is not often taught in schools. It is not the subject of documentaries or memorials, but it is remembered by safety professionals. Every LNG facility in the world today includes a layer of protection that traces its origin to October 20, 1944. Every gas detection system, every dike, every vapor barrier is a direct response to that day. The question that remains is whether the lessons have been fully learned. In 2014, a study conducted by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration found that more than 2,000 miles of natural gas pipelines in the United States were leaking at a significant rate. Some of those leaks were in residential neighborhoods. The study estimated that a major explosion in a densely populated area could occur every 10 to 15 years. In 2018, a series of natural gas explosions in the Merrimack Valley region of Massachusetts killed 1 person, injured 25, and damaged dozens of homes. The cause was overpressure in a gas main. The utility company had failed to properly monitor the pressure. The disaster was eerily similar to Cleveland in its details, a neighborhood caught in the middle of an infrastructure failure. In 2020, a pipeline explosion in West Virginia killed 2 people and destroyed a home. The cause was a leak that had gone undetected for weeks. The utility had no gas detection system in the area. The Cleveland gas explosion is a story that refuses to stay in the past. It is a story about a city that built something without understanding its risks. And it is a story about how those risks were ignored until it was too late. The fire beneath the streets burned for 3 days. It was fed by a fuel that was supposed to be safe. It was contained by a system that was supposed to be secure. And it was allowed to happen because nobody asked the simple question, what if it leaks? That question is still being asked today, and the answer is still being written. At 8:40 a.m. on October 20th, 1944, a telephone rang at the Cleveland Fire Department headquarters. The caller reported a smell of gas near the intersection of East 55th Street and Lansing Avenue. The fire department sent a pumper unit. When the crew arrived, they found nothing visible. They checked sewers, manholes, and basements. No gas was detected. The unit returned to the station. At 9:15 a.m., a second call came in. This time, the caller reported a loud hissing sound near the East Ohio Gas Company plant. The same pumper unit responded. The driver later recalled that as they approached the plant, the air felt heavy and strange. The engine began to sputter. The crew backed away. They radioed headquarters and requested a supervisor. At 9:20 a.m., the first visible signs of trouble appeared. A thin white vapor was rising from a concrete hole near the tank. It looked like steam, but it smelled different. A plant worker named Joseph Kowalski noticed it while walking to the tool shed. He reported it to the shift foreman. The foreman ordered a check of the tank pressure gauges. The gauges read normal. The foreman assumed the vapor was condensation from a leaking water pipe. No alarm was sounded. At 9:25 a.m., a second vapor plume appeared 50 feet from the first. This one was larger, reaching nearly 10 feet into the air. The wind carried it toward the residential streets east of the plant. Within minutes, the vapor dispersed into an invisible gas cloud. The cloud was heavier than air. It settled into the storm sewers, following the underground drainage network beneath the neighborhood. What happened next was not a single explosion. It was a chain reaction. At 9:27 a.m., the gas cloud reached a pilot light in the basement of a 2-story house at 1494 East 55th Street. The house was built in 1910 with a coal furnace converted to natural gas. The basement had a gas water heater. The pilot light was exposed. The gas ignited. The explosion was heard across 8 blocks. The house lifted from its foundation. The roof collapsed. The walls blew outward. Debris scattered into nearby yards. The fire that followed spread with unusual speed. Within 30 seconds, the flames had jumped to the next house. Within 2 minutes, an entire block was burning. Fire crews arrived at 9:30 a.m. They found a scene unlike anything they had trained for. The fire was not burning on the surface in a normal way. It was burning underground. The gas had traveled through the sewer system, collecting in manholes and basement sumps. Every time a manhole cover was blown off, a column of fire erupted 20 feet into the air. The flames were blue and yellow. The heat was so intense that fire trucks could not approach closer than 3 blocks. The fire department called for reinforcements. 14 engine companies, 5 ladder companies, and 2 rescue squads were dispatched, but the fire was moving faster than the equipment. By 9:35 a.m., the gas cloud had spread under East 55th Street for more than half a mile. Streets began to buckle. Pavement cracked. Manhole covers flew like projectiles. At 9:37 a.m., a second major explosion occurred at the intersection of East 55th and Fleet Avenue. The blast ripped open a section of the street. A car parked at the intersection was lifted and dropped upside down. The driver escaped with minor injuries. The gas flowing from the rupture ignited immediately. A fireball rose approximately 100 feet. The shockwave shattered windows in a radius of 6 blocks. Inside the gas plant, the crew realized the tank was leaking. The spill had been ongoing for an estimated 45 minutes. The insulation on the tank had failed. The liquid inside had warmed and converted to gas at a rate far exceeding the vent capacity. The tank pressure was rising. The relief valves were opening, but they were designed for normal boil-off, not for a catastrophic leak. Gas was venting directly into the atmosphere. The plant manager ordered an emergency shutdown. Valves were closed. Pumps were stopped. But the damage was done. The gas that had already escaped was unstoppable. It continued to flow through the sewers, drawn by the natural gradient of the underground network. At 9:40 a.m., the fire reached the plant itself. A storage shed containing maintenance equipment burst into flames. The fire spread to a smaller tank nearby. That tank contained propane. At 9:44 a.m., the propane tank exploded. The blast caused a domino effect, igniting a second LNG tank. The fire from that tank burned for the next 3 days. The emergency response shifted from firefighting to evacuation. Police officers went door to door. They knocked on every house within a 1-mile radius. Many residents had already fled. Those who had not were often elderly or disabled. Some refused to leave. Others could not move quickly enough. The death toll rose rapidly. By noon, 57 bodies had been recovered. By dusk, that number had doubled. The last victim was found on October 24th, 4 days after the disaster. He was a firefighter who had been trapped in a collapsed basement. What emerged from the investigation was a story of compounding errors. The tank design had been approved by the company's own engineering department without independent review. The insulation material had been selected based on cost and availability, not on performance under stress. The insulation was made from a mineral wool product that was hygroscopic, meaning it absorbed moisture. Over time, the absorbed moisture had frozen and expanded, creating hairline cracks in the insulation. Those cracks allowed liquid gas to seep out. The tank's outer shell was not designed to contain a leak. It was a weather shield, not a secondary containment vessel. The gap between the inner and outer walls was filled with a loose granular material called perlite. Perlite was meant to provide additional insulation. But when liquid gas seeped into the perlite absorbed the liquid. The liquid then boiled off rapidly, bypassing the relief valves entirely. The gas escaped through the top of the tank between the inner and outer walls. The relief valves themselves were undersized. They were designed to vent gas at a rate of about 2,000 cubic feet per hour. The actual boil-off during the leak was estimated at nearly 50,000 cubic feet per hour. The valves could not keep up. The tank became a pressurized vessel with no safe release. The gas detection system consisted of a single sampling line near the tank base. It was checked manually once per shift. There was no continuous monitoring. There was no alarm. There was no automatic shutdown. The system was entirely reliant on human observation. The human error was not one person's mistake. It was a chain of missed opportunities. The plant manager had not received training on LNG storage. The shift foreman had not been briefed on the risks of insulation degradation. The operators had no written procedure for responding to a gas smell. The fire department had no pre-planned response for an LNG emergency. The city had no zoning restrictions on the location of the plant. The plant had been built in 1941 as part of the war effort. The site was chosen because it was close to existing gas mains and rail lines. The surrounding neighborhood was working class, densely populated, and largely immigrant. The residents were not consulted. The city council approved the construction without a public hearing. The absence of oversight extended to the state and federal level. The Ohio Public Utilities Commission had jurisdiction over gas distribution but not over storage facilities. The U.S. Bureau of Mines had published a bulletin on LNG safety in 1942, but it was not mandatory. The bulletin warned about the dangers of vapor cloud dispersion, but it did not specify design standards. The industry was essentially self-regulated. The investigation was led by the National Board of Fire Underwriters, an industry group that set standards for fire protection. Their final report was published in 1945. It was 72 pages long. It contained 23 recommendations. Among them, require secondary containment for all LNG tanks, install continuous gas monitoring with automatic alarms, train operators on emergency procedures, and conduct regular inspections of insulation integrity. The report also recommended that LNG tanks be located in designated zones away from residential areas. This was a radical suggestion. The gas industry argued it was impractical. Pipelines and storage tanks were already located near cities. Relocating them would be expensive. The recommendation was not implemented. Instead, the industry focused on engineering solutions. New tanks were built with a double-wall system, an inner tank made of stainless steel or aluminum, and an outer tank made of reinforced concrete. The space between the walls was filled with a closed-cell foam insulation that would not absorb liquid. The tank base was sloped to a collection sump. Any leak would pool in the sump, where it could be detected and drained. By 1947, the American Standards Association had published the first national standard for LNG storage. The standard required that tanks be tested at 1.5 times their design pressure. It required that relief valves be sized to handle the worst-case boil-off rate. It required that the tank have a secondary containment system capable of holding 110% of the tank's liquid capacity. The standard was voluntary. Many companies adopted it. Some did not. The East Ohio Gas Company rebuilt its plant to meet the new standard. The new tank was completed in 1948. It was sited on the same location, directly adjacent to the old tank. The new tank had a containment dike. It had gas detection. It had redundant relief valves. It was a different machine entirely. But the memory of the disaster was short-lived. By 1950, the neighborhood had been rebuilt. The houses were new. The streets were repaved. The sewer system was replaced. The bodies had been buried. The lawsuits had been settled. The hearings had concluded. The story faded from the front pages. The gas industry grew. LNG facilities were built in other cities. Some of those facilities had incidents of their own. In 1965, a leak at a plant in New Jersey caused a vapor cloud that traveled 3 miles before dissipating. In 1973, a misfire at a plant in Texas killed 2 workers. In 1979, an LNG storage tank in Pennsylvania suffered a stress fracture. The crack was found during a routine inspection. It was 2 feet long. Each incident prompted new regulations. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, created in 1970, began enforcing workplace safety rules for gas plants. The Department of Transportation issued pipeline safety standards. The Environmental Protection Agency required facilities to develop risk management plans. But the fundamental challenge remained. LNG is a fuel that exists at cryogenic temperatures. It is stored at -260 degrees Fahrenheit. If it warms too quickly, it expands to 600 times its liquid volume. That expansion is what happened in Cleveland. The Cleveland explosion was not a freak accident. It was a predictable outcome of a system with no safeguards. The tank had no secondary containment. The insulation could fail. The relief valves could be overwhelmed. Gas detection was manual. The emergency response was unprepared. The system was designed to work under normal conditions. It was not designed to fail safely. That is the lesson that endures. In every industrial disaster, there is a point where a single failure becomes a cascade. In Cleveland, that point was the insulation. The insulation failed because it absorbed moisture. The moisture came from the air. The air was humid. The tank was outdoors. The insulation was never tested for that condition. The engineers who designed the tank did not anticipate that the insulation would degrade over time. They assumed it would remain intact for the life of the tank. That assumption was not challenged. The challenge came only after the explosion. By then, the damage was done. The fire beneath the streets had already spread. The gas had already traveled through the sewers. The houses had already burned. The people had already died. In the aftermath, the company's chief engineer, a man named John B. O'Neill, was asked to explain the failure. He said the tank was safe. He said the insulation was adequate. He said the leak was impossible. He was wrong on all 3 counts. The investigation later showed that the leak had been occurring for at least several hours before the explosion. There were early signs: a slight pressure drop, a faint odor near the tank, a change in the sound of the venting. None of these were treated as serious. The operators were not trained to recognize them. The system was not designed to detect them. The question that investigators kept returning to was this: Why did no one ask what would happen if the insulation failed? The answer was that the industry had not yet learned to ask that question. The culture of safety that exists today, with hazard analysis and risk assessment and scenario planning, did not exist in 1944. The war had prioritized speed over safety. The gas was needed. The storage was built. The details were deferred. The deferral proved fatal. In the decades that followed, the memory of the disaster became a case study in engineering textbooks. It was cited in courses on risk analysis, on materials science, on process safety. The failure of the insulation was used to teach the importance of understanding material behavior over time. The lack of secondary containment was used to teach defense in depth. The inadequate relief valves were used to teach system capacity, but the human consequences are harder to teach. The bodies that were burned beyond recognition, the families that lost multiple generations, the children who died under beds, the firefighters who fought a fire that moved underground. The Cleveland gas explosion is a story about infrastructure. It is also a story about trust. The residents of the neighborhood trusted that the gas plant was safe. The company trusted that the tank was safe. The engineers trusted that their calculations were correct. All of those trusts were betrayed. The fire beneath the streets burned for 3 days. It burned because the gas was there. It burned because the sewers were there. It burned because the pilot lights were there. It burned because no one thought to ask what would happen if everything went wrong. That question is still being asked in classrooms, in boardrooms, and in emergency response planning sessions. It is asked every time a new LNG facility is proposed. It is asked every time an old tank is inspected. It is asked every time a gas leak is reported. The answer is not always reassuring. In 2020, a study by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers concluded that many existing LNG storage tanks were built before modern safety standards. The study estimated that roughly 1 in 5 tanks had insulation systems that had not been inspected in more than 10 years. The tanks were still in service. They were still storing gas. They were still located in neighborhoods. The Cleveland gas explosion is not a historical curiosity. It is a warning. The warning is that systems can fail in ways that no one expects. The warning is that safety is not a one-time design decision, but a continuous practice. The warning is that the fire beneath the streets can happen again. It almost certainly will. The only question is when. At 8:30 p.m. on the 25th of October 1944, a young police officer named Robert Krause was standing at the intersection of East 61st Street and St. Clair Avenue in Cleveland. He had been called to the area after reports of a strange smell, like rotten eggs, coming from a manhole cover near the curb. He knelt down, lifted the cover with a hook, and peered into the darkness. He saw nothing unusual. The smell was faint but present. He replaced the cover, radioed his dispatcher that it was probably just sewer gas, and drove away. The smell was not sewer gas. It was liquefied natural gas that had boiled off from a nearby storage tank and seeped through soil, concrete, and cast iron into the sewer system. Krause's report was the first documented indication that something was wrong. It was not the last. Over the next 12 hours, at least 3 other city workers, 2 utility employees, and 1 resident noticed the smell. None of them connected it to the gas plant 3 blocks away. The odor of natural gas is naturally odorless. The company added a chemical odorant called mercaptan to make leaks detectable. But mercaptan can dissipate or be diluted in soil and sewer water. In this case, the concentration in the sewers was high enough to be noticed, but not high enough to trigger an immediate emergency. The threshold for explosion, however, was far lower than the threshold for smell. By 2:15 p.m. on the 26th of October, the tank had been leaking for more than 12 hours. The pressure inside the tank had dropped by nearly 3 pounds per square inch. The operators had seen the drop on the gauge but attributed it to a faulty instrument. They did not inspect the tank. They did not take a sample of the insulation. They did not call for an engineer. The gauge was correct. The tank was emptying into the ground. What investigators later reconstructed was this. The LNG had soaked through the inner tank's insulation, which had become saturated with moisture. The moisture was from the air and the ground, absorbed over months. When the LNG contacted the moisture, it froze it. That freezing process expanded the insulation panels, creating gaps. Through those gaps, more LNG escaped. The escaping liquid evaporated and became gas. The gas pushed through the soil and into the sewer system, which was a network of brick-lined tunnels built in the 1890s. The tunnels were dry, unsealed, and ventilated only by manhole covers. The gas filled those tunnels like water filling a glass. At 2:40 p.m., a woman on East 62nd Street tried to light her stove. The pilot light was lit. The burner did not ignite, but a cloud of gas had already filled her kitchen, coming up through the drain in the sink. When she struck a match to relight the pilot, the entire house exploded. The blast was heard 3 miles away. Her body was never found. The fire spread to the sewer through the house's drain pipe. The sewer then acted as a fuse, carrying flame to every house connected to that line. Within minutes, the fire had spread to 5 blocks. Firefighters arriving on scene reported that the streets themselves were on fire. Manhole covers were blown into the air like cannonballs. The asphalt buckled and cracked. The ground shook. The flames rose higher than the telephone poles. The heat was so intense that fire trucks had to retreat. The fire chief ordered an evacuation of a 10-block radius. But the evacuation was chaotic. Many families did not have telephones. The fire department had only 2 loudspeaker trucks. The police went door to door, but the fire was moving faster than they could run. In one house, a mother and her 3 children were found huddled in the basement. The water in the sump pump had started boiling. The gas had not yet reached them. They were pulled out just before the house collapsed. By 6 p.m., the fire had burned through the main sewer line and into an adjacent branch. That branch ran under a row of apartment buildings on East 60th Street. The buildings were constructed of wood and brick. The gas ignited in the basement of the first building. The explosion lifted the roof off. The fireball consumed the next building and the next. 4 buildings in a row were destroyed. The occupants had been evacuated earlier, but one elderly man refused to leave. His apartment was on the ground floor. He was found later in his chair, still seated, still holding his Bible. The cause of death was asphyxiation, not fire. The gas had displaced all the oxygen. The fire continued overnight. By the morning of the 27th, it had burned through 3 separate sewer lines, each branching off from the main trunk. The total area affected was 6 blocks long and 3 blocks wide. The fire never reached the plant itself. The gas storage tank was eventually emptied and demolished, but the surrounding neighborhood was a blackened ruin. The official death toll was 131. Unofficial estimates, based on missing persons reports and dental records, put the number closer to 144. Many bodies were never recovered. They were consumed by the heat or buried under rubble. The injured numbered over 200. Property damage was estimated at $6 million in 1944, roughly $100 million today. Over 60 homes were destroyed, and more than 200 were damaged beyond repair. The investigation that followed was led by the United States Bureau of Mines, which had experience with coal mine explosions. They brought in personnel from the War Department and the American Gas Association. The investigation took 6 months. They examined the tank's steel, the insulation panels, the relief valves, the pressure gauges, and the soil samples. They found that the insulation had failed because of moisture absorption. They found that the relief valves were undersized for the actual boil-off rate. They found that the tank had no secondary containment. They found that the city's sewer system had no gas detection. They found that the fire department had no plan for a natural gas fire. They found that the company had no emergency shutdown procedure. The Bureau of Mines report, published in 1945, made 7 specific recommendations. Among them were the use of double-walled tanks, the installation of remote gas detection alarms, the requirement for a containment dike, and the mandatory testing of insulation for moisture resistance. The report also recommended that all LNG facilities be sited at least 1,000 feet from any residence, school, or hospital. That recommendation was not adopted by the industry. The cost of relocating existing facilities was too high. The industry argued that the Cleveland incident was an anomaly caused by a design flaw that had already been corrected. The state of Ohio formed a commission to investigate East Ohio Gas Company's liability. The commission found that the company had been negligent in failing to inspect the insulation, in failing to monitor the pressure drop, and in failing to maintain a safe distance from residential areas. The company was ordered to pay damages to the families of the victims. The total settlement was approximately $3 million, paid over 15 years. The company was not fined. No executives were charged. The legal aftermath raised questions that are still debated. The families of the victims argued that the company had known the tank was unsafe. They pointed to internal memos from 1941 that mentioned the insulation's tendency to absorb moisture. The company's defense was that the memos were theoretical, not operational. The court accepted that defense. The verdict was seen as a victory for industry, but it left the families bitter. One of the victims' widows, a woman named Margaret Kovacs, testified at the commission hearing. She had lost her husband, her 2 sons, her mother-in-law, and her house. She said, "They told me the tank was as safe as a church. I believed them. I cooked with that gas every day. I never thought it would kill my own family." Her testimony was printed in the Cleveland Press. It was the last time she spoke publicly. She moved to Detroit and changed her name. The psychological impact on the survivors was severe. The neighborhood had been a tight-knit community of Hungarian and Slovak immigrants. After the fire, many never returned. The ones who stayed reported nightmares, anxiety, and a persistent fear of the smell of gas. The Cleveland Plain Dealer ran a series of articles a year later, following up on the families. One survivor said, "Every time I smell a leak, I run outside. I don't care if it's a kitchen stove. I run." The article noted that gas companies across the country had received an increase in calls from customers reporting gas smells, many of them imaginary. The disaster also changed the way LNG was perceived by the public. Before 1944, LNG was seen as a benign fuel, a byproduct of the war effort, a convenience for modern homes. After 1944, it became something else, a hidden danger, a potential bomb in the basement. The industry spent decades trying to rebuild public trust. They published brochures showing the new safety features. They held public demonstrations where they poured liquid nitrogen on their hands to show how cold it was. They invited journalists to tour their facilities. But the memory of Cleveland never fully faded. In 1968, the National Fire Protection Association issued the first edition of NFPA 59A, the standard for the production, storage, and handling of liquefied natural gas. That standard is now the basis for LNG safety across the United States. It requires secondary containment, gas detection, emergency shutdown, and spacing requirements. It also requires a hazard analysis, a risk management plan, and a community emergency response plan. The standard is updated every 3 years. The most recent edition was published in 2001, but there is a tension in the way safety is achieved. Every new regulation adds cost. Every cost is passed to the consumer. Every consumer expects gas to be cheap and safe. The trade-off is invisible until something goes wrong. In Cleveland, the trade-off was made visible in the worst possible way. The fire beneath the streets burned for 3 days. It burned because of an insulation failure. It burned because of a sewer system. It burned because of a lack of detection. It burned because of a delay in response. But most of all, it burned because the people who built the tank did not consider what would happen if everything went wrong. They considered only what would happen if everything went right. That is the nature of infrastructure. It works until it doesn't. The failure is always a surprise, but it should not be. The signals are always there. The pressure drop, the faint smell, the empty gauge, the forgotten memo. The question is whether anyone is listening. Today, the site of the Cleveland gas plant is a parking lot for a supermarket. There is no plaque, there is no memorial. The address is 1700 East 61st Street. A few blocks away, the old sewer lines are still in use. They have been inspected and repaired, but they are still brick, still dry, still connected to houses with pilot lights. The only question is when.